Imagine waking up one morning, reaching for your phone, and accidentally seeing a text meant for someone else. 11 words. That's all it took to collapse everything I had spent 6 years building. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how I died so I could finally find out who the people closest to me really were. I grew up believing that loyalty was the one thing in life you could actually count on. My dad was an electrician. My mom taught 3rd grade. They were married 31 years and never once, not once, did I see either of them betray the other. That was my model. That was the standard I carried into every relationship I ever had. So when I built my life in Seattle, good job, beautiful wife, best friend since college, I genuinely believed I had done everything right. I was a software engineer at a mid-sized tech company called Veridian Systems. Stable career, decent salary, work I was actually good at. My best friend Marcus Webb had been in my life since we were college roommates at the University of Washington. He went into tech sales and made more money than me and drove a leased BMW, and I was never once jealous because that's not how it works when someone is truly your brother. You celebrate their wins like your own. I met Natalie at a rooftop party in Capitol Hill on a warm August evening 3 years before any of this happened. She was a graphic designer, sharp and funny and warm in a way that made every room she entered feel different. We dated 2 years. I proposed badly and nervously on a hiking trail near Mount Rainier, and she laughed and said yes before I finished the sentence. Marcus was my best man. He gave a speech that made half the room cry. We bought a Craftsman house in Ballard. We split the mortgage. We built a life. Marcus was over for dinner twice a month. He and Natalie got along so well that sometimes I'd sit back and just watch the two of them argue about music or coffee or movies and feel this deep, uncomplicated happiness. My wife, my best friend, my life. I was such an idiot. The first sign was a text I was never supposed to see. It was a Tuesday morning in February, 5:47 a.m. Natalie was still asleep beside me. Her phone lit up when I accidentally brushed it reaching for mine. The preview was visible for exactly 2 seconds before the screen went dark. 11 words. Last night was everything. He'll never know. Sleep well, beautiful. The contact name, Marcus. I put my phone down. I stared at the ceiling. Natalie's breathing didn't change. I lay there for 47 minutes and I did not move. The feeling wasn't pain, not yet. It was more like that fraction of a second after a car crash before your brain catches up to your body. A total white stillness. At some point during those 47 minutes, I made a decision about the kind of man I was going to be through this. I am not someone who explodes. I am an engineer. When I encounter a problem, I don't attack it. I understand it first. Completely. Methodically. I got up. I showered. I went to work. And I started building a plan. The first thing I did was protect myself financially. Nothing dramatic, just quiet, careful repositioning. I redirected more of my direct deposit into my personal account. I opened a new savings account at a different bank. I documented every financial contribution I had made to our household over the past 2 years in an encrypted spreadsheet. Then I called my cousin Elena, a family law attorney in Portland. I used the word friend when I asked my questions. She answered every one of them. When she finished, she said, "You okay, Danny? My friend just wants to be prepared." I said, "Pause. Then, tell your friend to call me directly if he needs anything." The second thing I did was pay attention differently. The surface of my life stayed exactly the same. I laughed at Natalie's jokes. I cooked her favorite pasta, brown butter and sage, a recipe her mother had taught me. I texted Marcus about the Seahawks and argued about the offensive line like always. I was the same Daniel they had always known. Inside, I was made of ice. I started logging the patterns. Late arrivals home. Inconsistencies in small stories Natalie told about her day. Marcus canceling our plans with increasing frequency. His phone habits when we did hang out, the screen angles, the way he'd check it and then casually flip it over. I had set up our home Wi-Fi router myself. I understood our home network completely. Without capturing any content, I configured the router to log basic traffic metadata, timestamps, frequency, device activity. Within 2 weeks, the picture was clear. Daily contact, sometimes multiple times a day. Late nights after I'd gone to sleep. Early mornings after I'd left for work. I saved everything to an encrypted drive. 8 weeks in, I called Elena again. This time, I didn't use the word friend. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Danny, I'm so sorry." I told her I didn't need sorry right now. I needed strategy. She respected that. We talked for 2 hours. Washington State community property law, documentation, my legal position, what would hold up and what wouldn't. At the end, she said, "You're handling this very calmly." I told her I was saving the not calm for later. She said, "Good. Don't waste it on them before you're ready." The idea came to me on a Thursday night in April. I had been sitting with the same question for weeks. How do I end this in a way that is truly final? A confrontation would give them time to coordinate. They would deny, minimize, reframe. They would recover, and I would lose. I needed something else. Something that would strip away the performance entirely and show me, and everyone who mattered, exactly who these two people were when they believed I was no longer in the picture. I needed to disappear. Not forever. Not actually. But long enough and convincingly enough to let them believe Daniel Mercer was gone, and to watch what they did next. I opened a new document on my encrypted drive. I typed 2 words at the top, Operation Funeral, and I began to write. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from sleeping next to someone you no longer recognize. Not the loneliness of an empty bed, that kind is clean, at least. Honest. This was the other kind. The kind where you lie 6 inches from a warm body in the dark and feel more alone than you have ever felt in your life. Where every small sound she makes, a sigh, a shift, the soft exhale of sleep, feels like a lie you're being forced to witness up close. I lived inside that loneliness for 2 months, and I used every second of it. Operation Funeral began with research. The concept was simple on the surface. Create a situation where Natalie and Marcus genuinely believed, for a controlled window of time, that something serious had happened to me. Serious enough to shock the performance out of both of them. Serious enough that whatever they were hiding would surface before they had time to choreograph their response. But simple concepts require complex execution. And I was not going to rush this. The first question was believability. Whatever scenario I constructed had to be credible. Not Hollywood dramatic, but the kind of thing that actually happens to real people. Car accident, a medical emergency, something sudden and plausible. I settled on a hiking accident. I had been an avid hiker for years. Natalie knew this, Marcus knew this, anyone in my life knew this. Solo hiking trips were not unusual for me. I'd done the Enchantments sections of the PCT, a solo 3-day loop near Olympic National Park 2 summers ago. It was completely within my established pattern of behavior to take off on a solo trip for a long weekend. The scenario I built was this. I would tell Natalie I was going on a solo hike, a 2-night trip into the backcountry near North Cascades. I would leave Friday morning. By Saturday afternoon, a carefully arranged sequence of events would suggest that I had not returned to my car as planned. A missed check-in, an unreachable phone, enough to trigger genuine concern, but not enough to launch a full search and rescue operation that could spiral beyond my control. I would be gone for exactly 48 hours. What I needed to know was simple. What do these 2 people do when they think I am gone? The logistics took 3 weeks to build. I enlisted exactly 1 person in this plan. His name was Kevin Park, a friend from my college days who now lived in Bellingham, about 90 minutes north of Seattle. Kevin was one of those rare people who asks very few questions and keeps every secret he has ever been given. I told him the minimum he needed to know, that I had discovered my wife was cheating with my best friend, that I needed his help with something, and that I needed him to trust me. Kevin said, "What do you need?" That was it. No drama, no lengthy discussion. Just what do you need? I needed his cabin. Kevin owned a small property outside of Concrete, Washington, a genuinely remote area east of the Cascades, 2 hours from Seattle. Off-grid enough that a missing phone signal would be entirely unremarkable. I would stage my vehicle at a trailhead, leave a note in my glove compartment that mentioned my planned route, and spend the 48 hours at Kevin's cabin, watching, waiting, and monitoring. The monitoring was the critical piece. 2 weeks before the planned date, I installed a small home security camera in our living room. This was not unusual. We had discussed home security before, and I had mentioned wanting to add coverage. I told Natalie I was setting up a new system. She nodded and went back to her laptop. I set the camera to upload continuously to a private cloud account she had no knowledge of. I could access the feed remotely from my phone. Whatever happened in that house while I was missing, I would see it. The Friday I left felt surreal. I packed my hiking gear, real gear, used gear, the kind of equipment that showed authentic wear. I kissed Natalie goodbye in the kitchen. She was making coffee, hair still loose from sleep, wearing the gray university sweatshirt she'd had since before we met. She smiled and said, "Be careful. Text me when you're at the trailhead." I looked at her for a moment longer than usual, long enough to memorize the specific quality of that smile. Easy, practiced, completely unbothered. The smile of a woman with a clear conscience. Or the smile of a woman who had learned to perform one convincingly. "I will," I said. I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. I texted her from the trailhead at 9:15 a.m. "Made it. Heading in. Signal will be spotty. Love you." Her response came 30 seconds later. "Love you too. Be safe." I stared at that heart emoji for a long moment. Then I put the truck in park, transferred to Kevin's car, which he had left for me in the parking area as planned, and drove to the cabin. I was at Kevin's place by noon. He had left coffee and groceries. A note on the counter that said, "You've got this. Call me if you need anything." I sat down at the small wooden table by the window, opened my laptop, and pulled up the camera feed. The house was empty. Natalie had left for her studio, presumably. Normal Friday. I waited. At 4:47 p.m., Natalie came home. I watched her move through the living room on the small laptop screen, grainy but clear enough. She set her bag down, checked her phone, smiled at whatever she read. Then she typed back, quickly. The smile stayed on her face the entire time. She poured a glass of wine. At 6:20 p.m., Marcus's BMW pulled up in front of my house. I want to tell you that watching that moment didn't affect me. I want to say that 2 months of cold preparation had armored me completely against the reality of seeing it. But that would be a lie, and this story has enough lies in it already. It hit me like a physical impact. My hands went still on the table. My chest did something complicated and painful, because no matter how thoroughly you have intellectually accepted a truth, there is a difference between knowing something and seeing it. He walked up to my front door. He didn't knock. He used a key. He had a key to my house. I sat back in my chair and I breathed. Slowly, deliberately, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way you breathe when you are trying to keep something from becoming something you can't take back. He had a key. How long had he had a key? When had she given it to him? Had it been made from mine, copied without my knowledge, handed over like it was nothing? Like my home was just a location, not the thing I had built my entire adult life around? I wrote the time in my notes. 6:20 p.m. Marcus enters with key. Then I kept watching. They were comfortable together in a way that told me everything. Not nervous, not furtive, not the behavior of two people doing something they knew was wrong and were afraid of being caught. They moved around my kitchen like people who had been doing this for a long time. He knew where the wine glasses were. She leaned into him in the easy, unconscious way you only lean into someone when their presence has become ordinary to you. This was not a new affair. The realization landed with a weight I hadn't anticipated. I had suspected duration, the metadata, the patterns, the practice coordination all pointed to it, but seeing it confirmed in the casualness of their body language was different. This had been going on long enough that my house had become their comfortable place. Long enough that my absence was not an intrusion into their secret, but simply a convenience. I had not been a husband being betrayed. I had been a schedule being worked around. I documented everything I could. Timestamps, duration, every detail that might matter later. At 11:34 p.m., the living room light went off. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark at Kevin's kitchen table for a long time. And then, very quietly, in a way I hadn't allowed myself since that February morning, I let myself feel the full weight of what I was losing. Not the marriage, I had already grieved that, but the story I had told myself about my own life. The narrative of a man who was loved, who was trusted, who had built something real. That story was gone, but I was still here, and I still had one more day before they expected me back. One more day to see what else they would reveal, and based on what I had already seen, they were far from done revealing. There is something deeply strange about watching your own life continue without you. Saturday morning at Kevin's cabin. Coffee going cold beside my laptop. Camera feed open on the screen. Outside the window, the Cascades sat gray and indifferent under a low sky, and I sat there watching a live feed of my house the way you might watch a nature documentary. Detached, clinical, taking notes, except the animals in this documentary were my wife and my best friend, and the habitat they were destroying was everything I had ever built. I had not slept. Not really. A few hours of something thin and restless that didn't qualify as rest. But I was sharp. Sometimes grief and fury together produce a clarity that sleep can't touch. I opened my notes document. I checked the timestamp on the camera feed. 7:52 a.m. I waited. At 8:14 a.m., the kitchen light came on. Natalie first. Hair loose, same gray sweatshirt from yesterday. She moved to the coffee maker, my coffee maker, the one I had spent 40 minutes researching before buying because I cared about the grind consistency, and started the morning routine. Our morning routine, the one we had built together over 3 years of ordinary Saturdays. Marcus appeared 7 minutes later. He was wearing one of my t-shirts. I stared at the screen for a long moment, wrote it down. 8:21 a.m. Marcus wearing OP's clothing. It was such a small thing. Objectively, a borrowed t-shirt. But there is a specific brand of disrespect that lives in small things, the casual, thoughtless kind that only exists when someone has stopped thinking of you as a real presence in their own life. He wasn't wearing my shirt because he was making a point. He was wearing it because it was there and it was convenient, and somewhere in his mind, in the comfortable architecture of the secret life they had built, I had become that convenient or inconvenient, present or absent, but never quite real enough to factor into the calculation. I wrote, "They are not afraid." That was the thing that struck me most, watching them move through Saturday morning in my house. There was no tension, no guilt visible in their body language, no furtive checking of phones, no anxiety about the front door, no whispered conversations. Just two people in a kitchen on a weekend morning, relaxed and familiar and completely unbothered, which told me something important. They had done this before, many times, enough times that the guilt, if it had ever existed, had been fully processed, rationalized away, and filed somewhere it no longer caused discomfort. I was not a wound to them. I was a logistics problem they had already solved. At 10:33 a.m., something happened that I had not anticipated. Natalie sat down at the kitchen table with her coffee and opened her laptop. Normal enough, but then she picked up her phone and made a call. The camera had no audio. I could see her lips moving but not what she was saying. She talked for about 4 minutes. Her expression during the call was not the easy, relaxed expression of someone chatting with a friend. It was focused, purposeful, and at one point, briefly, unmistakably. She glanced toward the hallway where Marcus had disappeared, and then back at the phone, and something in her face shifted into an expression I had seen before but never understood until now. It was the expression she wore when she was managing something. Natalie was an extraordinarily competent person. One of the things I had always admired about her was her ability to handle complexity. Her business, her client relationships, the 1,000 small logistics of our shared life. She was a manager by nature, always 3 steps ahead. I had just never understood that I was one of the things she was managing. When the call ended, she sat quietly for a moment, then typed something on her laptop. Then she called Marcus back into the kitchen. I watched them have what appeared to be a serious conversation. Not an argument, nothing heated, but focused, deliberate, the kind of conversation that has an agenda. I could not hear a single word. I sat back and felt the first real chill of uncertainty move through the cold clarity I had been operating in. Because whatever that conversation was, whatever had just been discussed and decided in my kitchen on a Saturday morning while I sat 2 hours away in a cabin, I had no idea. and not knowing felt suddenly acutely dangerous. I made my first mistake of the entire operation at 2:15 p.m. I called Kevin, not to change the plan, just to talk to another human being, because the isolation of sitting alone with what I was watching had reached a point where I needed the sound of a voice I trusted. Kevin answered on the second ring and listened while I described what I'd seen. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Dan, the t-shirt thing, that's not just careless. That's ownership." I hadn't thought of it in exactly those words, but he was right. There is a difference between careless and ownership. Careless is forgetting to hide evidence. Ownership is not thinking there's anything worth hiding. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said. "You're not fine. I know, but I'm functional." He told me to eat something. I realized I hadn't since the night before. I found a can of soup in Kevin's cabinet and heated it on the stove and ate it standing up, watching the camera feed on my laptop on the counter, and thought, this is what my life has become for the next 24 hours. Soup and surveillance. There are moments in crisis where the absurdity of your own situation becomes visible to you, and you can either laugh at it or let it break you. I laughed. A short, quiet sound that surprised me, and then I kept watching. The second thing I hadn't anticipated happened at 4:40 p.m. A car I didn't recognize pulled up in front of my house. A woman got out, mid-30s, dark hair, well-dressed. She walked up to the front door with the comfort of someone who had been there before. Natalie opened the door before she knocked. They hugged. I sat forward, wrote down the time. 4:40 p.m. Unknown female visitor arrives. The three of them, Natalie, Marcus, and this woman, sat in my living room for almost 2 hours. The conversation looked animated at times, serious at others. The unknown woman had a leather portfolio that she opened at one point and appeared to reference. At another point, Marcus leaned forward and pointed at something in it. Something about the portfolio. Something about the organized, businesslike nature of the whole interaction. It nagged at me. This was not a social visit. This was a meeting. At 6:38 p.m. the woman left. She and Natalie hugged again at the door. Marcus shook her hand. I stared at the camera feed for a long time after her car disappeared. Then I picked up my phone and did something I should have done weeks earlier. I hired a private investigator. His name was Roy Delaney. I found him through Elena, who had mentioned him in passing during one of our calls. A former King County Sheriff's deputy who had moved into private investigation work 10 years ago. Well-reviewed, discreet, professional. I texted Elena asking for his number. She sent it without asking questions. Roy answered on the third ring with the flat, unhurried tone of a man who had heard everything and was surprised by nothing. I explained the broad situation. He asked 3 precise, efficient questions. Then he said, "I can have eyes on your property within 90 minutes. "I need more than eyes," I said. "I need to know who the woman was who just left my house. License plate." I read him what I had noted from the camera feed. A pause. Keyboard sounds. Then, "Give me 2 hours." Roy called back in 90 minutes. The woman's name was Sandra Okafor. She was a licensed real estate agent based in Seattle, specializing in residential property sales in the greater King County area. I heard the words. I processed them, and something cold and absolute settled into my chest. A real estate agent. In my house. With my wife and my best friend. On the Saturday that they believed I was missing on a hiking trail. I set the phone down very carefully on the table. Outside the cabin window, the Cascades had gone dark against a steel sky. Inside, the only sound was the hum of my laptop fan and my own breathing. They weren't just having an affair. They were planning a future. A specific, practical, logistically considered future. One that involved my house. The house I had chosen, purchased, renovated, and paid for. The house my name was on. The house that, in their version of the future, was apparently already transitioning into an asset to be managed. They had moved from betrayal into architecture, from cheating into planning. And somewhere in that plan, in the meetings with real estate agents and the portfolios and the quiet, serious conversations in my living room, I understood that the timeline I was working against was not open-ended. They had a schedule. which meant I needed to move faster than I had planned. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the notes document. I scrolled to the section labeled Phase 3, the part of Operation Funeral I had hoped I wouldn't need. I highlighted it, read through it once. Then I picked up my phone and called Elena. "It's time," I said. Pause. Then her voice, steady and sure. "I'll be ready." I closed the laptop. I looked out at the dark mountains for a long moment. And then, for the first time since February, something shifted in my chest. Not grief, not fury, but something colder and more purposeful than either. I had gone into this weekend hoping to understand what I was dealing with. I understood now, and tomorrow Daniel Mercer was coming back from the dead. Sunday morning, last day at Kevin's cabin. I woke at 5 a.m. without an alarm. Outside, the mountains were still dark. Inside, everything was very quiet and very clear. The kind of clarity that only comes after you have fully accepted something. Not made peace with it, not forgiven it, but accepted it completely, down to the bone, so that it no longer has the power to surprise you. I made coffee. I opened my laptop. I reviewed everything. The camera footage, the timestamps, the metadata logs from the router, Roy Delaney's report on Sandra Okafor, the financial documentation Elena had helped me prepare. Every thread of the past 3 months, laid out in order, clean and complete. Then I opened Phase 3 and read through it one final time. Phase 3 was not about confrontation. Confrontation was easy. Anyone could scream across a kitchen. Phase 3 was about consequence. Specifically, about making sure that whatever happened next, I was the one who controlled the terms. I had spent 3 months preparing for a moment that was now less than 12 hours away. I was not going to waste it on anger. I finished my coffee. I called Roy. "Everything in place?" I asked. "Everything in place," he said. I called Elena. "Ready. Ready," she said. "Danny, are you sure about all of it?" I looked out the cabin window at the mountains going gray in the early light. "I've never been more sure of anything," I said. I drove back to Seattle. I arrived home at 11:15 a.m. on Sunday, parked in the driveway, sat in the car for exactly 60 seconds. Not hesitating, just marking the moment. The last 60 seconds of the version of my life that had existed before February. After I walked through that door, nothing would ever look like it had before. I was fine with that. I got out of the car. The look on Natalie's face when I walked through the front door will stay with me for the rest of my life. She was in the kitchen. She heard the door and called out, "Hello," in a voice that had a specific quality I recognized immediately. Not the warm, easy voice of a wife greeting her husband. A tighter voice, cautious. Then she appeared in the kitchen doorway and saw me. The color left her face. Not dramatically. She didn't gasp or stumble. Natalie was too controlled for that. But the blood drained visibly from her cheeks in the space of 1 second, and her hand came up and gripped the doorframe in a way that told me everything I needed to know about what she had been expecting this Sunday to look like. "Daniel," she said. "Hey," I said. I set my hiking pack down by the door, calmly. Then I looked at her and I said, in the most ordinary voice I could produce, "We need to talk." She tried. I will give her that. Natalie was intelligent and composed, and she tried. She said she didn't know what I meant. She said she was glad I was home safely. She asked about the hike. She moved toward the coffee maker, the universal deflection mechanism of people who need something to do with their hands. I let her talk. I stood in the middle of my kitchen and I listened and I watched her perform and I waited until she ran out of things to say. Then I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and pressed play on the camera footage from Friday night. The sound of Marcus's car door closing. His footsteps on the front path. The front door opening from the inside with a key. Natalie went absolutely still. I let it play for 30 seconds. Then I stopped it. "How long?" I asked. A long silence. Long enough that I started counting seconds in my head. I got to 11 before she answered. 2 years, she said. 2 years. I had been married to her for 3. I nodded. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt in ways I don't have language for. But I had already done my grieving at Kevin's cabin in the dark. and I was not going to spend what was left of my grief in front of her. "And the real estate agent?" I said. "Sandra Okafor. Saturday afternoon. What was that conversation about?" The composure cracked then. Just slightly, a fracture at the edges. She hadn't known about Roy. She hadn't known about the camera. She had believed, up until 30 seconds ago, that she was still holding all the information in this situation. The realization that she wasn't, that she had never been, not for the past 3 months, moved across her face like weather. "Daniel, the house," I said. "You were talking about selling the house." She didn't answer, which was its own answer. I want to tell you what happened next as clearly as I can, because this is the part people always want to know. The revenge, the payback, the moment where the wronged party unleashes everything and the people who caused the damage finally face what they've done. Here is what I did. I did not scream. I did not break anything. I did not call Marcus and threaten him or humiliate anyone publicly in a moment of raw emotion. I had spent 3 months building something much more durable than a scene. The following morning, Elena filed the divorce petition. Because I had documented 3 months of evidence, the metadata logs, Roy's surveillance report, the camera footage, the financial records, and because Washington state is a no-fault divorce state but courts absolutely consider financial misconduct in asset division, my legal position was exceptionally strong. More importantly, I had already moved my personal assets, quietly, legally, incrementally over the course of 3 months. The joint account contained exactly enough to cover the next month's mortgage and utilities, no more. Everything else was protected. The house, the Craftsman in Ballard that I had chosen, that I had made the down payment on, that I had renovated with my own savings. Elena had already confirmed my documentation of contributions was thorough enough to ensure I would walk away with my equity fully intact. There would be no selling of my house by anyone other than me, on my terms, at a time of my choosing. Sandra Okafor's portfolio had been for nothing. Marcus, this is the part of the story I find hardest to tell. Not because of what I did, but because of what he said when I finally faced him. I called him that Sunday evening. I told him I was home. I told him I knew everything. I told him I had documentation. I told him that I was not going to involve mutual friends or his employer or his family. That was not the kind of man I was. But that our friendship was over completely and permanently, and that I needed him to understand the full weight of what he had destroyed. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dan. I genuinely am. I know that doesn't mean anything." "You're right," I said. "It doesn't." Then I said the thing I had been saving for 3 months. The thing I had written in my notes document at the cabin at 3 a.m. on Saturday night when I couldn't sleep and needed somewhere to put the truest version of what I felt. "You were the best man at my wedding, Marcus. You stood next to me and you watched me promise to love her for the rest of my life. And you were already planning this. That's not just betrayal. That's a kind of cruelty that takes real effort. I hope one day you understand what you actually are." I hung up. I have not spoken to him since. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. I kept the house. Natalie received her share of our joint assets, which was fair and legal and exactly what the documentation supported. Nothing more, nothing less. Elena was extraordinary. The process was not painless, but it was clean. I had built it to be clean. Natalie and Marcus, last I heard through the mutual friends I still share, are together, living in an apartment in South Lake Union. I don't know if they're happy, and I have genuinely stopped caring. What I know is this: the life they were trying to build on top of mine, the one that involved real estate agents and key copies and 2 years of practice deception, did not turn out the way they planned. Because I was not the passive element in my own story that they had assumed I was. I still live in the Craftsman in Ballard. On clear mornings, I can smell the salt air from the back porch. I have repainted 2 of the rooms. I adopted a dog, a 3-year-old rescue named Scout who takes up most of the bed and has no regrets about it. I have been on a few dates, nothing serious, nothing I was rushing. My mom calls every Sunday. My cousin Elena checks in regularly. Kevin came to visit last month and we spent a weekend hiking in the enchantments. Real hiking this time, and we didn't talk about any of it once. We just walked and breathed cold mountain air and watched the light change on the water. It was the best weekend I'd had in years. People ask me sometimes, now that I've told parts of this story to people I trust, whether I regret the way I handled it, whether Operation Funeral was too much, whether I should have just confronted them immediately and gotten it over with. Here is my honest answer. No, not because it was comfortable. It wasn't. Sitting alone in a cabin watching your marriage dissolve on a laptop screen is one of the loneliest experiences I can describe. Not because it was painless. It was the most painful thing I have ever done. But because at the end of it, I walked away with my integrity intact, my finances protected, my legal position solid, and the complete truth in my hands. I walked away having never once lost control, never once given them the satisfaction of seeing me broken, never once done anything I was ashamed of. They had built their plan on the assumption that I was the same reliable, trusting Daniel I had always been, the one who would be too stunned and too hurt to respond strategically. They were right about who I used to be. They were wrong about who I had become. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 34 years old. I planned my own funeral, and it was the best decision I ever made.